Let me share with you the story of Lesha and Masha, who had been married for 8 years. According to Alexei, their marriage was held together by silly jokes and teenage crushes. At the age of 30, Alexei and his 27-year-old wife had a son. Recently, their baby turned 3 and started going to kindergarten. This allowed Maria to finally go back to work. However, during her absence, some changes occurred in the company, including a new director. Upon meeting him for the first time, the woman was taken aback by how wonderful Pyotr Alexeyevich was. He was almost a decade older than Maria, who had just returned from her maternity leave, craving social interaction and male attention. She was flattered that her boss seemed to be flirting with her, and she flirted back while trying to maintain appropriate boundaries. However, it was clear that Pyotr Alexeyevich was open to taking things further. The flirtation continued for about a month. One day, the boss summoned Maria to his office and closed the door behind them to execute his plan. Although the woman initially put up some resistance, she was not entirely opposed to the idea. However, after the encounter, Maria felt embarrassed every time she saw her boss. Her cheeks would flush, and she would mumble during their conversations. Despite this, Peter was surprisingly strict with her, yet he took every opportunity to pinch or lightly slap his subordinates' buttocks. On another occasion, after everyone had left the office, the two lovers were sitting together in Peter's office. Peter was standing by the window smoking, while Maria was getting dressed. Suddenly, he said, "I'm sorry for talking to you so rudely in front of everyone." Masha smiled as she buttoned up her blouse. "It's all right. I knew we had to be discreet," she replied. "We should get going, though. I promised my husband I'd be home on time." Peter extinguished his cigarette and closed the window. Despite having a husband and child waiting for her at home, Peter's comment about his wife still stung. Maria pressed her lips together and continued packing in silence. Frequent work delays had begun to take a toll on their relationship. Lyosha, who had never been the jealous type, suddenly became nervous and started constantly questioning Maria about her whereabouts. This behavior was new and unsettling to Maria, who had to endure several calls a day from her spouse asking what she was doing at work. The sudden need for control frustrated Maria, and she expressed her anger by whispering into the phone, "Don't call me so much. You're embarrassing me," when Alexei once again called to check on her. "I'm just worried," shouted her husband. "You should watch our son," retorted Maria. After their argument, Maria would hang up feeling irritated and would continue grumbling to herself about how dissatisfied she was with Lyosha's behavior. This happened several times. One day, after a quarrel with her husband, Peter Alexeyevich decided to scold Maria in front of her colleagues. The confrontation left Maria in tears, and she sought refuge in the bathroom. Her colleagues sympathized with her, not realizing that she herself had contributed to the situation. Feeling overwhelmed with resentment and sadness, Maria sat crying in the bathroom. One day, Peter asked Maria to stay late after work to finish some reports. However, Maria was still upset by the hurtful words he had spoken to her earlier that day and suddenly refused to stay. The situation was taking a toll on her, with fights with her husband and public humiliation from her boss. Maria was tired of the vicious cycle that was bringing her more misery than pleasure. She wanted to break free from it all. When she refused Peter's request, he was surprised. He moved closer to her and whispered so that only Maria could hear what he was saying. "You have no right to refuse," her boss declared. She felt a surge of anger and defiance, her tears threatening to spill over. She met his gaze with a fierce look, determined to stand her ground. But his next words left her shaken to the core. "And what will you do to me? I'll tell your husband all the details of what happened, and to make sure he believes me, I'll mention the birthmark in that special place." Peter's voice was laced with anger, but his tone remained cold and controlled. He was confident in his threat, and Mary knew there was little she could do to fight back. "You're staying here tonight," he concluded. He raised his voice and repeated his words. Pyotr Alexeyevich then departed, leaving Maria standing with her mouth agape and her hands clutching the edge of the table for support. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of her lover's indiscretion, preventing her from regaining her composure. A look of terror was etched onto her face. Masha managed to hold herself together until the last of her colleagues had left the room. As she rose from her desk, her phone began to ring. When she glanced at the screen, she saw her husband's name and realized the absurdity of the situation. The woman made a conscious decision not to answer the phone. She planned to call her husband back in 30 minutes and lie, claiming that she had accidentally left her phone in her bag and hadn't heard it ringing. Pyotr Alexeyevich was already waiting for her at his place. But as Maria arrived, the rose-colored glasses that she had been wearing fell away. Suddenly, the man no longer seemed as attractive as he had before. Instead of the man who had once filled her with passion and desire, she now saw a pompous and narcissistic individual who had threatened her. Meanwhile, Peter was smugly smiling to himself. He was like a cunning fox who had successfully trapped another victim. "What a clever girl," he remarked. "I made the right choice." Maria trembled as she spoke. "Aren't you afraid of telling my wife?" The man laughed. "Do you think she doesn't already know? She's fine with everything. Money, has a way of making problems disappear." Maria was left with nothing to say, realizing that her attempt to threaten her lover had failed. Similarly, he had been unfazed by her words. It dawned on her that she had never really counted on her plan succeeding. At that moment, Maria was unaware that her phone was ringing incessantly with calls from her husband. Meanwhile, Alexei was already halfway to the place where Maria worked. In his mind, he had imagined the worst-case scenario. He vividly pictured bursting into her office and finding her with another man he didn't know. Every detail played out in his mind, fueling his anger. Alexei was convinced that his wife was cheating on him. He had once noticed a nearly faded bruise on her shoulder, and Masha had explained it away as a sports bag rubbing against her skin. The man didn't believe a single word of Masha's explanation. He informed the security guard that he had come to pick up his wife, then began to climb the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though two lead weights were dragging down his legs and preventing him from reaching his destination. His heart was pounding against his ribcage, threatening to burst out of his chest. Alexei paused outside the door, trying to catch his breath before entering. He hesitated for a few moments, holding onto the doorknob, before finally mustering the courage to push it open. The corridor and several other offices were lit up, adding to the surreal and tense atmosphere. Lesha scanned the room, searching for Maria's desk, but she was nowhere to be seen. However, her belongings were still present, and her phone was lying on the desk. As he stood there, the silence was suddenly interrupted by muffled slapping sounds emanating from an office down the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, so he kicked it open without hesitation. The sight that greeted him was enough to make his teeth grind together and his fists clench. On the table in front of him, he saw Maria lying with a man in a white shirt nestled between her legs, surrounded by a pile of papers. As soon as he heard someone enter, he jumped away from Masha like he had been scalded, hastily attempting to pull up his pants. Alexei let out a roar and charged towards his wife's lover, throwing punches in a fit of rage. The woman attempted to intervene, but her efforts to stop the fight were futile. Finally, she grabbed her husband by the neck with both hands and forcibly pulled him away from his opponent. It was only then that Lesha looked at his wife's face for the first time. She was sitting there, tears streaming down her face, with mascara and the remains of her lipstick smudge. Maria appeared miserable. When they got into the car, both of them were at a loss for words. Lyosha kept dabbing at Peter's swollen lip with a napkin. At that moment, all he wanted was for Masha to vanish. He felt repulsed being around her. Conversely, she yearned to be embraced by her husband, to explain her side of the story, and to ask for his forgiveness. Sadly, neither of their wishes was granted that day. Alexei wasted no time in filing for a divorce, despite Maria's pleas for him not to do so. She wept uncontrollably over the phone, making promises that everything would be different and that it would never happen again. But her husband remained adamant. He had no intention of altering his decision. The woman was forced to resign from her job as rumors about her relationship with her boss began to circulate among her colleagues. Moreover, the boss himself persistently requested that Masha leave, which she ultimately did. The sudden changes in her life left her disoriented and shaken. She persevered as best as she could, solely because of her son, whom Maria could not let down. After the divorce, she frequently reminisced about Alexei, but he severed all contact with her. It was then that she comprehended the phrase her mother used to repeat, "We don't appreciate what we have until it's gone." That was her story. Share in the comments. What do you think of the situation and the behavior of the characters? And thank you for listening to the story to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Have a nice day.